Okay, welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are diving into a truly monumental book, one that's really shaped how we think about, well, everything from psychology to belief. William James's The Varieties of Religious Experience.
Oh, absolutely. It's one of those rare books, isn't it? It
Wow.
feels like both, rigorous analysis and just this incredible collection of human stories
Right.
published over a century ago, but it digs right into what people actually feel, what they do when they're grappling with the big questions or connecting with something they sense is divine.
And our mission with this deep dive really is to give you the essential insights, the surprising bits, the core arguments from James, without you needing to spend weeks wading through hundreds of pages.
Yeah, think of it as your shortcut, your way into understanding why this book is still so important.
So what are we looking at specifically?
Well, we've pulled out key excerpts. We're covering his unique definition of personal religion, the famous contrast he draws between different temperaments.
The healthy-minded versus the sick souls.
Right. Exactly. And then the phenomenon of conversion, the maybe surprising value he finds in saintliness, the often baffling world of mystical states.
Yeah, that's a fascinating section.
And finally, how he tries to tie it all together with his sort of philosophical conclusions.
Now, a huge part of understanding James here is getting how he approached this whole thing. He wasn't interested in, like, arguing theology or analyzing church structures.
No, not at all. He was laser focused on the inner experience of the individual person. That was his territory.
And he deliberately chose to look at the most intense examples, sometimes even, extreme ones, visions, radical conversions.
Right, because he argued that these vivid, almost exaggerated cases actually reveal the essence of religious feeling more clearly than, say, everyday mild faith.
Makes sense, like studying outliers to understand the norm better.
Precisely. And right from the start, he lays down this critical marker. He says, look, we need to assess the value, the meaning of these experiences completely separately from their psychological or even physical origins.
Okay, this is really key. Let's make sure we're super clear on this. James is saying, I'm interested in personal religion, the raw, unorganized feeling inside someone.
Yeah, he calls it an unorganized rudiment compared to like established churches. But for him, that's where the real core is.
And he needed that distinction, didn't he? Because he was arguing against something he called medical materialism.
Exactly. That's the perspective that says, you had a religious vision. Well, you were probably just, fasting, low blood sugar.
Or that feeling of peace must be linked to some nervous instability.
Right, like the example of George Fox, the Quaker founder, whose feet felt like they were burning with divine fire.
A medical materialist would just jump on that, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
Classic psychosomatic symptom.
And James just stops them right there. He says, hold on. That whole line of thinking is a total dead end.
Why?
Because, he argues, if you dismiss the meaning or the truth of an experience based purely on its origin, you have to apply that logic across the board.
Okay, so every thought you've ever had, every feeling.
Even your scientific conclusions, your skepticism, they all arise from a physical state in your brain and body at that specific moment.
So if origin invalidates value, then nothing has value. Science itself would be out the window because it comes from, squishy brains of physical bodies.
Precisely. He insists we have to look at the fruits, the lasting impact an experience has on a person's character, their actions, and evaluate that. It doesn't matter if it started with a weird physical sensation or an emotional wave or something that looks like a medical condition. It's about the effect, not just the initial cause.
And that's why he looks at the extremes.
Exactly. By examining these intense, really diverse forms of religious expression, he thinks we get a clearer picture of what this fundamental religious tendency in human nature actually is at its core.
It's like studying Olympic athletes to understand human potential for movement rather than just watching people walk down the street. Right. Makes sense.
So, armed with that pretty unique approach, James then dives into what he sees as these two fundamental ways people are kind of wired religiously, two basic temperaments, almost opposite starting points.
Okay, let's start with the first one, the healthy-minded.
Right. This temperament is, well, naturally optimistic. They have this built-in will to believe in the good stuff, the positive aspects of life.
Sometimes to the point of downplaying or ignoring the bad stuff.
Yeah, or even actively denying the existence of evil or suffering, either in the world or within themselves. James calls it a deliberately optimistic scheme of life.
And he uses the mind cure movement as a big example here, which feels actually surprisingly relevant even today.
Totally. He explains their basic philosophy, this sense of oneness with the divine, something you access through your subconscious mind.
And they weren't so focused on sin in the traditional sense.
No, they kind of diverged from that. They were more focused on overcoming distress, especially like nervous conditions, anxieties. Their methods involved intense concentration, silent meditation, really directing the mind to achieve positive outcomes.
And the stories he shares are pretty incredible. People claiming they were healed of paralysis or serious nervous disorders just vanishing.
Feeling an influx of the deific breath, as he puts it, it sounds a bit like, I don't know, a 19th century manifestation practice mixed with spiritual belief.
And James saw a psychological parallel there.
Yeah, he compared their core message, "You are well now," if you would but believe it, to the core message of Luther and Wesley, which was, "You are saved now," if you would but believe it.
Just applied to a different set of problems. Nervous distress instead of sin.
Exactly. But here's where James adds that layer of nuance. He says, while this approach definitely brings happy relaxation, he contrasts it with what he calls a strong happiness linked with pain that you find elsewhere in religious life.
So he's subtly suggesting that maybe the healthy-minded view, by kind of bypassing or denying suffering, might miss out on a certain depth, a certain intensity of experience.
That seems to be the implication, which leads us directly to the other temperament, the sick soul.
Okay, and this is the person for whom the reality of evil, suffering, imperfection, it's not something you can ignore.
No, it's intensely, inescapably present. They feel this profound sense of world sickness, as he calls it.
These are the people who would really connect with, say, Goethe saying life felt like nothing but pain and burden.
Or Luther feeling utterly cast away because of his own internal struggles, his fleshly lust. They're acutely sensitive to the negative side of existence.
And this perspective can lead to certain philosophies.
Yeah, philosophies of despair, almost, like certain kinds of stoicism that aim for safety by just expecting very little rather than striving for great joy. Or even in extreme cases, anhedonia, the literal inability to feel pleasure.
And they often describe this really wrenching internal conflict, right? A divided will.
Exactly, like Bunyan in his spiritual struggles, feeling these warring desires and duties just pulling him apart, leaving him in total agony.
Tolstoy is another key example he uses here.
A classic one. Tolstoy's sudden, overwhelming sense that life was utterly meaningless. These constant, tormenting questions, why, wherefore, what for? He felt like something fundamental had just broken inside him, leaving him completely adrift.
So it's a stark contrast. While the healthy-minded try to look away from evil or minimize it, the sick soul stares right into it.
Right. And here's James's kind of surprising insight. This acute sensitivity to pain, this wrestling with darkness, can actually lead to a deeper sense of life's significance.
How so?
Precisely because it forces this profound encounter with reality, often involving humiliation or despair. It's almost like the pain itself unlocks a certain depth that the healthy-minded might skate over.
And that struggle, especially that divided will of the sick soul, often seems to be the setup for something else.
Exactly. It often sets the stage for a dramatic transformation that James calls conversion. It's the process, and it can feel really sudden or unfold more gradually, where that inner conflict, that division resolves. The person achieves a state of inner unification, equilibrium, a sense of mental wholeness and stability.
Now, psychologically, I think James mentions researchers like Starbuck connecting conversion to normal adolescent development, right? That period of identity formation.
He does note that correlation, but James, characteristically, is less interested in the general pattern and more fascinated by the subjective feeling of it, that sense of a radical internal reset.
And that feeling can be incredibly powerful.
Oh, yeah. People describe literally feeling like a new creature. The world can look different, brighter, suddenly filled with meaning.
And things like worries, anger, even addictions.
They can just lift.
Yeah.
Vanish, sometimes instantaneously.
Like that example he gives of Mr. Bradley, where a worry and anger just disappeared in a moment.
Or the drunkard who loses his craving for alcohol completely overnight. It feels less like you just changed your mind about something and more like you've been given a whole new operating system.
So how does James try to explain this, especially the suddenness?
This is where he brings in a concept from Frederick Myers, the idea of the subliminal or transmarginal consciousness.
Okay, what's that?
Think of it like the part of the iceberg that's underwater. a deeper level of our mental life that we're not normally aware of. James hypothesizes that these powerful saving experiences, these sudden infusions of energy or insight or resolution, might actually originate from this deeper level.
And they burst through into our ordinary consciousness.
That's the idea. It
Yeah.
helps explain the suddenness, the feeling of power, the sense of something happening to you rather than you doing it.
Ah, okay. So he's suggesting that the suddenness, that feeling of passivity, like being grasped by something, maybe even the connection sometimes noted between conversion experiences and things like nervous instability or automatisms.
Automatisms being actions done without conscious thought, yeah.
Right. All those might be different ways this deeper subliminal self is interacting with or maybe breaking through into our everyday awareness, like it's a channel opening up.
That's a good way to put it. It's a channel for energies or insights from this, let's say, wider self to enter our conscious life, sometimes really dramatically.
But then James circles back, doesn't he, to his core principle. How do you judge if a conversion is real versus just some temporary emotional high?
Exactly. And his answer is consistent.
It's not the method sudden or gradual. It's not the drama, the visions, the convulsions, the feelings of heat or light.
Nope, it's the fruits. Always the fruits.
The lasting change in disposition and conduct.
Absolutely. Does the person actually become more loving, more peaceful, more self-controlled over the long haul? He quotes Jonathan Edwards approvingly on this, saying, "True conversion results in a changed kind of person. You see it in a permanently patient heart, in the love of self eradicated."
It's the character transformation. That's the real test.
That's the test.
So building on that idea of transformation and its fruits, James then looks at the enduring character traits that embody this deeper religious life, what he calls saintliness.
Right. He sees these not just as virtues, but as splendid excellencies. These are the mature fruits of faith lived out over time.
And he identifies some key ones. What's first?
First, charity or love. And this isn't just, liking people who are like you. It's an expansive, often universal love. It can even extend to those you'd consider enemies.
He uses that powerful example of Mrs. Edwards, Jonathan Edwards' wife, who described this overwhelming feeling of love for all mankind. It makes you wonder, is that level of unifying emotion truly possible for people?
It's a profound question he raises. Then there's purity.
Which isn't just about conventional morality for James, is it?
No, it's deeper. It's this intense sensitivity to inner inconsistency, inner discord, a real longing for absolute spiritual clarity and simplicity.
And this can lead to renunciation.
Yes, a willingness to renounce worldly distractions, amusements, certain social obligations, sometimes even family ties, basically. Anything perceived as potentially compromising that inner spiritual tone, that clarity.
This is where you see that impulse towards seclusion, right? The church fugient, as he calls it, monasteries, hermits.
Exactly. He gives that little example of the young sister asking her superior if she should even speak during recreation time. It shows that intense focus on purifying the inner landscape by stripping away anything seen as discordant.
Okay, love, purity. What's next?
Asceticism, which sounds harsh, but James analyzes it carefully. It's self-discipline, self-severity, literally mortification of the flesh.
But people find value in it.
Saints often find a surprising positive pleasure in sacrifice. They view it as a powerful expression of loyalty, of devotion to the divine or a higher principle. Obedience, too, falls under this obeying a spiritual director or God's will that becomes the ultimate sacrifice of your own intellect and will.
He gives examples, right?
Yep.
Like the curate of Ars enduring intense cold.
Yes, as a spiritual discipline. Or Father Rodriguez talking about how poverty and obedience are essentially about letting God be the pilot, trusting completely.
Even St. Francis renouncing books.
Right, that drive to strip away external aids, external comforts, and rely solely on the inner connection. It's about embracing nakedness and destitution, not masochistically, but as a path to profound character alteration.
Now, James isn't presenting a purely idealized picture here. He sees the potential downsides, the excesses of saintliness.
Oh, absolutely. He's very clear that these same virtues can curdle. They can lead to fanaticism or crippling scrupulosity, obsessive guilt over minor things, or make someone so detached from the world they just can't function effectively in society. Especially, he notes, if their intellect is kind of narrow.
He mentions Margaret Mary Alacoque.
Yeah, whose intense mystical devotion to the Sacred Heart seemed, in his view, to produce mostly internal experiences rather than outward, useful human fruit in the world.
And he also points to the tricky mix of intense piety with, well, ruthless politics.
Right, figures like Catherine Catherine of Siena or Luther or Cromwell. He sees that as a potential negative fruit,
Yep.
where religious fervor gets entangled with worldly power in problematic ways.
So, okay, he acknowledges the potential for distortion, the excesses. Why does James still argue that these saintly qualities have this indispensable value?
Because, he argues, they are economically necessary, by which he means they contribute something vital to the overall health and functioning of the human collective, society as a whole.
Yeah.
Saints, for James, are the leavens of a better mundane order. They introduce a radical gentleness, an unshakable patience, a selfless love into the world that acts as a counterforce to the hardness, the selfishness, the violence that's also present.
So they kind of pull the average upwards, even if their own lives seem extreme or impractical.
That's the idea. They break the mold, they soften the edges, they model possibilities that benefit everyone, even indirectly.
Okay, so beyond the moral transformation seen in saintliness, James explores another really different avenue of religious experience, one that seems to offer access to a different kind of truth altogether: mystical states.
Right. This is where things get, well, mysterious. These are experiences defined by a powerful sense of unity with something absolute, or a deeper reality, something that seems to completely transcend our normal, everyday conscious awareness.
And they don't have to be like full-blown visions, necessarily.
No, they can begin quite simply. Maybe just a sudden, profound sense of meaning washing over a familiar idea. He mentions Luther's sudden insight into the meaning of forgiveness of sins.
Or Tennyson's waking trances, feeling like he was dissolving into the infinite.
Exactly. But then there are the more fully developed mystical states. And James tries to pin down their characteristics, acknowledging how hard they are to describe. He identifies 4 key marks.
What are they?
First, ineffability. You just cannot adequately describe the experience in words. It defies language.
Like trying to explain color to someone born blind?
Precisely. Second, the noetic quality. Despite being ineffable, these states feel like states of knowledge. Deep insight into fundamental truth. You feel like you've grasped something incredibly profound, even if you can't formulate it rationally afterwards. And the insights might even seem paradoxical.
Third.
Transiency. They don't last. They're intense, but they're fleeting moments, not permanent states.
And finally,
Passivity. The person having the experience feels less like they are doing something actively and more like they're being grasped, held, moved, or controlled by some higher power or force. It happens to them.
he uses examples that describe really altered perceptions, right? Seeing the world completely differently or feeling this overwhelming sense of presence.
Yes, and he makes this provocative point that even certain substances, he mentions alcohol, nitrous oxide, can induce some of the feelings associated with mystical states.
Like the sense of unity or altered perception.
Right. But, he argues, they typically lack that crucial noetic quality, the sense of genuine insight, and they don't usually have the lasting, positive, transformative value of religious mystical states. It's like getting the feeling without the meaning or the lasting fruit.
The accounts he includes are just fascinating, though.
They really are, like the clergyman whose soul felt like it opened into the infinite, feeling a rushing together of the two worlds, the inner and the outer.
Or Dr. Buck's experience of what he called cosmic consciousness.
Yeah, where he suddenly perceived that the universe is not composed of dead matter, but is a living presence, and felt this immediate consciousness that I possessed eternal life then. Just incredible descriptions.
So what's the big takeaway for James from these mystical states?
He argues they're profoundly important because they demonstrate that our ordinary, everyday, rationalistic consciousness, the one based on our senses and logical thinking, is not the only way of knowing reality. It's just one type of consciousness.
So they crack open the possibility that there might be other orders of truth, other realities accessible through non-ordinary states.
Exactly. It fundamentally challenges the idea that rationalism holds a monopoly on truth. But again, he's very careful about the claims you can make based on them.
Right. He says a mystical state is absolutely, undeniably authoritative.
For the individual who has it, to them, it feels more real than anything.
But it carries no inherent authority for anyone else.
Precisely. Your vision is your truth, but you can't demand that I accept it as mine just because you experienced it.
Okay. So James has laid out all this incredible raw material, the different temperaments, the dramatic transformations of conversion, the virtues of saintliness, these glimpses into mystical realities. How does he then try to make philosophical sense of it all?
Well, he sees the job of religious philosophy not as, building abstract doctrines from scratch. Instead, it should be about analyzing and interpreting the facts of religious experience as we find them.
comparing them to what we know from other fields, like science.
Exactly. And he's pretty blunt, actually, about the traditional philosophical arguments for God's existence.
The classic proofs: first cause, design, moral argument, consensus gentium.
Yeah, he basically dismisses them as unpersuasive abstractions. He finds them cold, logical, and lacking livingness. They just don't connect, for him, with the actual felt reality of religious people.
So instead, he turns to his own philosophical method.
Pragmatism,
Wow.
which he's famous for, of course. He brings in this idea that the meaning of any thought or concept is found in its practical consequences.
And that truth is what works well.
Essentially, yes, though he qualifies it on the whole. He wants to evaluate religious ideas not just on their logical coherence, but by their effects. How do they actually work out in people's lives? What difference do they make?
So how does he apply this to religion itself? What's the core of religion, pragmatically speaking?
For James, religion, when it's felt deeply as an inner fact, is fundamentally an intercourse. It's a conscious and voluntary relation with a perceived divine power.
He loves that quote from M. Sabatier, doesn't he?
He does. Prayer is religion in act. That is, prayer is real religion. It's in the active relationship, the communication, the back and forth, that religion becomes real.
And he gives that fantastic, really concrete example of George Miller.
Yes. The man who ran orphanages in Bristol, apparently relying solely on prayer for their daily needs, food, money, staff, everything.
James sees Mueller's detailed accounts not just as nice stories, but as potential evidence of this commerce, as he calls it, through prayer actually leading to tangible, practical results. It demonstrates a radical kind of faithfulness in action.
And he draws this interesting contrast between the religious mindset and the scientific one.
How so?
Well, scientific thought deliberately tries to remove the personal point of view, right? To find objective, universal laws. Religious thought, conversely, is intensely centered on personality.
The divine meets him on the basis of his personal concerns.
Exactly. James argues, quite provocatively, that the axis of reality runs through our private destiny. Our most intimate personal experiences might actually be where we touch something most fundamentally real.
And what about the feeling of religion when it's healthy?
He describes it as thenic, which means, basically, strong, cheerful, expansive. It overcomes melancholy. It's dynamogenic. It's a tonic that generates energy and vitality. It makes life feel more intense, more meaningful.
Okay, so this leads us to his big, maybe most speculative, but also central idea, his own overbelief, as he calls it.
Right. This is where he tries to offer a hypothesis to account for these experiences, especially the transformative and mystical ones. He proposes that the conscious person, the me that we know ourselves to be,
Isn't the whole story.
exactly, it's continuous with a wider self, a larger reality. And the connection point is through that subliminal consciousness we talked about earlier, that part below the threshold of awareness.
And that's where the saving experiences come from. That connection is the positive content of religious experience.
That's his hypothesis. That subliminal door is where energies, insights, a sense of connection from this wider reality can flow into our conscious lives.
And does he speculate about what that wider self or larger reality might be?
Well, he does. He suggests it could be what people mean by God. That this wider self, acting through the subliminal realm, is the divine interacting with us.
But he doesn't necessarily limit it to traditional monotheism.
No, and this is really intriguing. He actually entertains the possibility that this higher reality, this wider self, might be finite, not infinite, or might even be plural.
Plural, like multiple divine powers.
Yeah, he suggests that the sheer variety of religious experiences across cultures and history might actually point towards a reality more complex than simple monotheism. He even says it might make a return to a form of polytheism seem conceivable, based purely on the evidence of human experience. That's a pretty radical thought.
Wow. Okay, so that was quite a journey. Our deep dive into William James's incredible exploration of really the raw material of human belief and experience.
Yeah, we've navigated through those contrasting worlds, the healthy-minded optimists and the sick souls wrestling with darkness. We've seen the transformative power of conversion.
Explored the demanding but maybe essential virtues of saintliness.
And peeked into that profound, often indescribable realm of mystical states.
And we've grappled with James's attempt to make sense of it all, not through abstract dogma, but by focusing squarely on the psychological reality, the philosophical implications.
Always grounding it in personal feeling, and his fascinating hypothesis of that wider self reached through the depths of our own minds.
And James really leaves us with this powerful thought, doesn't he? that our ultimate responsible concern is with our own private destiny, and that being religious, in this very personal sense he describes, helps us grasp ultimate reality at the only points at which reality is given us to guard.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What does it mean to seriously consider that your deepest, most personal feelings, those moments of profound struggle or unexpected peace or sudden insight, might not just be random psychological blips?
But potentially the very points where you are actually touching upon something truly real and expansive, something like that wider self James is talking about.
Yeah. What does that idea of a subliminal door connecting you to something larger mean for your own potential? For how you connect, not just with yourself, but with the whole world around you? Something to think about.